He lost his job for fixing a school bus on his day off. 12 days later, the whole county was chanting his name, and that very engine became a symbol of change. 5-cent bolt. Pine Harbor didn't wake to alarms. It woke to sound. The groan of the rusted dock, the sharp cries of gulls, the distant rumble of engines rolling through the fog. But in the school district's bus depot, a concrete building tucked behind the salt warehouse, silence lingered longer. Only one man showed up before dawn. Miles Campbell knew this garage better than his own kitchen. Every crack in the floor, every oil stain, carried a story. He didn't look like the kind of hero who ends up on a wall of honor, grease on his hands, an old county jacket, the gait of a tired but stubborn man. He came in earlier than anyone, not because he wanted to, but because that was the only way to fix what no one else even noticed. Once he had made a mistake, trusted someone else's repair, skipped the second check, and ended up explaining himself to the parents of a child who was dropped off on the shoulder after the bus died in a snowstorm. Since then, manual inspection only. Only what he saw with his own eyes. That morning, he stood in front of bus number 17. The vehicle had been decommissioned in the spring, technically listed as reserve, but in reality, just rust, a battered interior, and an engine marked for scrap. Miles hadn't thrown it out. Not the bus, not the motor. In Pine Harbor, a spare bus wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. It meant 5 kids from the outer roads could still get to school when another route failed. He pulled a worn parts box from his bag. Everything inside had been bought with his own money, picked up at garage sales, classifieds, leftovers from other jobs. From those scraps, from bolts with mismatched heads, he was building something more than an engine. He was building reliability, whether anyone saw it or not, whether anyone cared or not. The wall clock ticked, 6:10. The first cigarette of the fleet supervisor wouldn't arrive for another 50 minutes. Until then, only the hum of the ventilation system, the click of a socket wrench, and the steady breath of a man doing a job simply because someone had to. No one expected much from that shift, least of all that it would spark the loudest story ever to come out of that quiet garage. Mornings in the Pine Harbor Fleet garage always started the same. The smell of warm metal, the clicking of relays in the power box, and the wheezing struggle of the ancient coffee machine. Miles Campbell was finishing his third walkthrough, unofficial, unscheduled, but familiar. He knew every wobble, every flicker, every flaw the others shrugged off as just wear and tear. Over the past 6 months, he'd patched 6 systems, rebuilt a control panel from salvaged relays, and extended the brake life on bus number 12 with nothing more than a gasket swap. No one asked how. No one cared why. On his shelf sat an old cookie tin, faded label, dented lid. Inside were bolts, washers, nuts. Some with tags, others simply rescued, cleaned, and tested. One bolt, pulled from a generator back in 2019, was worth less than a nickel, but had already saved 2 stabilizers on buses serving kids from the South End. Miles didn't call them small parts. To him, they were the ones holding everything together when everyone else had given up. That morning, Rita Olson showed up. Fleet manager, sharp eyes, constant tablet, and a paper cup of coffee in hand. She walked into the workshop and said flatly, 2 weeks till the parade. Every bus in the lineup, no exceptions. The March of Knowledge Parade was a yearly affair where county officials showed off how smoothly the school system ran. A convoy of 30 buses would roll through downtown Pine Harbor to brass band music, flags on the antennas, kids in neat uniforms. The mayor's PR office was already finalizing camera angles. On paper, a celebration. In practice, a race against the clock. 15 of the 30 buses needed repairs. 3 wouldn't start. 2 were listed as substitute only. One of them was bus number 17. The one Miles had been rebuilding. Rita ran through the checklist without even looking at the vehicles. The reports were all that mattered, the image, the optics. Listen, Campbell, she said, I know you like messing with these wrecks, but that parade has to look good. If we need to strip the junkers for parts and load them into the camera buses, we do it. It's all about the picture. Got me? She was about to leave, then paused, glanced at the row of tired buses, her brow furrowed for just a second, then quieter. If even one bus breaks down, my son stays home with his inhaler instead of sitting in class. I'm not risking that again. Got it? There was no warmth in her voice, but something in it wavered. And for the first time, Miles saw not just her coldness, but her fear, the kind an adult carries after too many failures. I already got burned by one hero fixer, she added. Took me 3 months to clean up the mess. I don't want another one. Miles nodded, but his stomach tightened. He knew what strip the junkers meant. It meant tearing apart number 17, the one he was preparing for a route with no backup. In Pine Harbor, 3 districts had no alternate lines. One bus, kids go to school. No bus, no school. That's simple. That ignored. He went back to the shelf, pulled down the cookie tin, ran his fingers through the bolts. By feel, not sight. Found one with a jagged thread. It had saved 2 buses already. He turned it over in his hand, like he had 100 times, and then... Maybe she's right, he thought. Maybe I'm just clinging to scraps instead of pushing for real change. Maybe I'm stuck in the past. He remembered that day 3 years ago. A cold morning, a modified bus that wouldn't start, a boy named Jeremy, waiting alone on the shoulder, shivering until help arrived. Miles' patch hadn't failed, but the system still had. Since then, his vow had never changed. Only hands-on checks, only what he could trust, even if no one noticed. He sighed, but his hand stayed steady. He dropped the bolt into his jacket pocket, grabbed a rag, walked back to number Padanarodi, because he knew exactly where he was needed. The morning run of Route 23 began as usual. A draft from windows that never truly sealed, the scent of rubber and sleepy backpacks thudding softly against the railings. Driver Becky Sanders turned the ignition on the new bus number. 3. The pride of the depot, purchased with a federal grant. The dashboard flashed a green OK, but a kilometer later, climbing toward a worn viaduct, the steering wheel suddenly stiffened, as if dipped in syrup. The power steering unit shuddered, and at the curve, the vehicle gave a loud snap. Losing assist completely, Becky took the sharp turn purely on experience. Kids shrieked, notebooks scattered to the floor. She called the duty mechanic, and over the radio came a dry verdict. Likely a faulty valve in the hydraulic line. 4th case this month. The brand new bus was sent straight to the bay, and in Rita Olson's office, emergency mode kicked in. 11 days remained until the March of Knowledge, and each broken Grant bus tarnished the pristine image meant for the press. The solution was instant. Strip the working power steering unit from backup bus number 17 and install it in the shiny number 3. The worn-out vehicle? Shelved. The paperwork could be backdated. Scheduled component transfer. For the parade photos, all that mattered was a yellow chassis gleaming with fresh paint. Who'd be riding it after the celebration? A secondary concern. That evening, Miles was counting bolts in his pocket while overhearing the foreman's talk with Rita. The words hit like slaps. Why waste money on relics? The city's going to shut down those outlying routes anyway if they turn unprofitable. Miles knew exactly what route they meant. Route 23, the one that served Spruce Creek, a village where half the families lived on assistance, and the school bus was their only lifeline to town. If number 17 was pulled even for a day, those kids would be stranded by someone else's budget decisions. That night, he slipped into the main storage bay, found a power steering unit from a batch of decommissioned military parts, never logged, heavy as a bucket of cement, and reeking of navel grease. No one would notice it missing. Those crates had gathered dust for years without inventory tags. Miles cleaned the valve seat, replaced a gasket, pressure tested it by hand, and he knew it would last longer than the factory original. Meanwhile, in the far corner of the hangar, the cannibal crew was already unscrewing bolts from number 17, preparing it for teardown. He stood in a beam of yellow light beneath the gantry crane, weighing his options. Surrender his rebuilt unit and give Route 23 a chance, or silently watch as bureaucratic victory erased children's right to education. In his pocket, he felt the 5-cent bolt again. He clenched it tighter. and understood if he chose no, 17, it could cost him more than a reprimand. It could cost him his career. He might be fired, might be accused of tampering, or just pushed aside. No tools, no authority, no trust. He knew all this, and still couldn't choose otherwise. "You really gonna baby that rust bucket?" came a familiar voice behind him. Frankie Torres, one of the younger techs, the type who joked more than listened. "If she gives out, you'll be the first to know," Miles replied without turning around. Frankie squinted. For a second, it looked like he'd crack a joke, but he didn't. Just gave a short nod. The kind you give someone you know won't quit. Outside, early March, the snow had begun to fall. Inside, the countdown had begun. 11 days to the parade. And one man who could no longer pretend that someone else's negligence was just part of the system. He dropped the bolt back into his jacket pocket, grabbed a rag, returned to number 14. He knew exactly where he was needed. It was 10:37 p.m. when the final switch clicked off in the main hangar. Most of the mechanics had gone home, some to bowling, others to a show, and some simply to sleep. Only Miles Campbell remained, as he had on dozens of such nights. When the reports were signed, the boss is gone, the office lights dark, that's when the real work began. He stood before bus number 17, which was scheduled to be officially decommissioned the next day. Engine removed, steering unit pulled, crossed off the list. Everything he'd spent weeks assembling, everything that worked, but didn't sparkle in the system's eyes. Tools lay in drawers beside him. One held bolts and washers never logged into inventory. Another marked defective, do not use, held parts deemed unfit. And between them stood Miles. Between what was required by regulation and what was right by conscience. He reached for the ratchet, but his hand trembled, and the tool hit the concrete with a dull clang. The echo rang out. Miles exhaled, crouched down, and closed his eyes. "Maybe my time is over," he muttered into the emptiness. No answer came, just the hum of the old ventilation fan and a faint drip somewhere in the pipes. But he stood up anyway, broke the seal on the drawer of untouchable parts, pulled out the hybrid pump with the modified fitting, the one he'd built in the evenings, just in case no chances were left. And he made a decision. He didn't install it in the shiny number 3 like they wanted. He put it in the old one, his bus, number 14. He worked fast, but with precision. Removed the old unit, cleaned the threads, installed the new one, tightened everything down, checked the pressure. It held. Not perfect, not by the book, but honest. Enough to get there. He didn't fake any documents. Just wrote, "Power steering unit replaced. System functional. Clearance granted." No notes, no name, no explanations. By the time the clock read 2:11 a.m., he sat on the bench by the wall, wiped the back of his neck with his hand, and pulled that same bolt from his pocket. Heavy, slightly rusted, with worn threads. There was more meaning in that piece of metal than in the entire instruction binder collecting dust on Rita Olson's desk. He stared at it for a long time, not knowing if this would hold, not knowing if anyone would understand, not knowing if the bus would break down again at the worst possible moment. But he knew one thing. If the kids from the outskirts made it to school, then this night had been worth it. He was about to turn off the lights when footsteps echoed in the hangar. Quiet, unhurried. A moment later, a man stepped into view, wearing a jacket with the County Transit logo. In his hand, a tablet. On his lapel, a button camera. "Miles Campbell?" he asked curtly. "Who's asking?" "Inspector Martin Lowe. I'm here unofficially. We haven't met. Understood?" He stepped inside, scanned the bus, and added, "You know where this is going. Been around long enough." Miles said nothing, waiting for the hit. "Here's the offer. You move to diagnostics. No tools, no arguments. Just paperwork, graphs, signatures. 3 years. Then retirement. Quiet exit. All it takes is staying out of the gears." "And if I refuse?" "Then the system will eat you alive, Campbell, and won't even choke." He nodded toward the bus. "You decide what you want to walk away with." He placed a folder on the table and left. No threats, no backward glance, as if he already knew the choice had been made or that it still could be. Miles sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the air hummed. The lamp's shadow wavered on the floor. He set the bolt down beside the folder. Two objects, one solid, one official, both about the future. One spoke of compromise, the other of cost. He didn't write a refusal, didn't sign the offer. He simply turned off the lights and stepped into the dark. Not as a victor, but as someone who could no longer stay still. The March of Knowledge parade began with fanfare, sunlight, and a sense of staged serenity. That morning, the square in Pine Harbor filled with reporters, parents, and officials, badges all the same, intentions all different. To the sound of a brass band, 32 buses, new, mid-range, and decommissioned but freshly painted, lined up in a column. Children waved flags from the windows, and the county mayor delivered a speech about driving the future toward knowledge. Bus number 3, shiny, spotless, and bearing a polished logo, rolled out fourth. At the tail end, quiet and nearly invisible, followed bus number 17. Few people knew it was the one now carrying students from the farthest district. Spruce Creek. The very bus that wasn't supposed to run. The one Miles Campbell had poured everything into, including his belief that old machines and old principles still meant something. On the sidewalk, a little apart from the crowd, stood a man in a dark coat. He didn't applaud, didn't take photos, just watched. From the window of bus number 17, a girl waved, not knowing her father, Brent Rowley, was studying every turn. His eyes were sharp, focused. He didn't say anything, but he understood already. If this bus made the run without failure, someone had put soul into that machine. Maybe not at the factory. The route wound along the coast over the canyon bridge, a stone viaduct laid back in the 60s. There, the road narrowed sharply, turning left with a steep incline. That very spot, just a day before the parade, had been the site of bus number 3's steering failure during a test run. No one had been hurt, but the unease lingered in every mind. Behind the wheel of number 3, veteran driver Harold Becker gripped the steering wheel with tension. Officially, the unit inside was refitted. A recycled part from another decommissioned bus rushed into place. Harold hadn't protested, but before departure, he'd glanced at Miles, who stood silently by the depot gate. The look asked, "Can I trust it?" Miles didn't speak, just gave a single, steady nod. As the convoy began its descent into the canyon, the crowd quieted, not out of fear, but out of something almost ceremonial. The upper road traced the cliffside. Below it, the river churned. Forests stretched in the distance. Drivers knew this was where vehicles were truly tested, not on paper, but in real life. Bus number 3 entered the curve. Sharp bend, slower speed. Inside, dozens of children. Harold froze for a moment. Pedal, wheel, hydraulics. Everything felt different. The bus jerked, then steadied. Imperceptible to passengers, unmistakable to a seasoned driver. He made the turn. His heart pounded 3 extra beats. At the rear, where bus number 17 followed, the feeling was completely different. Calm, confidence. The driver, young Sarah McMillan, knew her bus was old. Knew she carried the kids who had the farthest ride home. But during the turn, the machine held steady. On course, no shaking, no drift. Sarah even allowed herself to exhale and smile at a child in the rearview mirror. On the hillside, Brent Rowley kept watching. Not the flags, not the speeches, just the way the vehicle handled reality. He leaned forward as if to be sure it wasn't his imagination. And for the first time in a long while, he felt the urge to find out who had built that bus. A minute later, both buses emerged onto the plateau. The parade continued. From the outside, nothing happened. No drama. No headlines, just 2 quiet moments that determined who in that convoy actually deserved attention. In the technical radio booth, where mechanics monitored transmissions, someone muttered, "Anonymous report on number 17 got sent to the county office before the parade." "No way," someone replied. "Yeah. Strange thing is, Rita asked to keep it quiet." They said it low off the record, but it was enough. One mechanic nearby pieced it together, heart sinking. Someone inside had laid a safety net, but not for Miles. At that moment, he sat on the concrete step outside the hangar. His back ached. His hands were scratched. The same old bolt still rested in his pocket. But his face showed no fear, no regret, because everything that needed to hold had held. Because the seconds on that canyon turn were the truth he stood for. The morning after the parade was dry and gray, as if the city itself hadn't decided whether to feel proud of the celebration or not. Miles arrived at the depot an hour before shift change, out of habit, but someone was already waiting for him at the gate. An inspector from the county transportation office, holding a tablet, a button-sized camera on his lapel, and the kind of look that leaves no doubt. They were looking for someone to blame. The evening before, Miles had received a phone call. A man's voice offered him a job. Clean shop, stable paycheck, but no improvising, only what's in the service manual. Miles didn't reply. He just hung up. The hallway smelled of cheap coffee and ozone from the laser printer. While the inspector connected the camera for a live protocol stream, the transit manager, Rita Olson, flipped through a stack of papers. Yesterday's fanfare had turned into dry wording. Unauthorized component replacement, potential safety threat, violation of procedural hierarchy. Every phrase flew straight into the lens, the signal instantly uploaded to the county's cloud server. This kind of transparency was a point of pride for the administration. When the red light on the camera blinked on, Rita began to speak loudly, as though addressing not just the inspector, but an invisible audience. She cited act numbers, references to maintenance codes, even the insurance clause under which the county now risked millions in liabilities. Miles stood opposite the desk, turning the same 5-cent bolt between his fingers. The conversation wasn't about him anymore. It was about clauses and subclauses. There was no room in them for the canyon turn, or the drivers whose nerves had been spared, or the children who had made it home safely. At that moment, the inspector's phone lit up with notifications. A video by a regional blogger showing mismatched serial numbers had started trending. More clips followed. Parents from Spruce Creek shared how, for the first time in a year, their kids had arrived on time and without the smell of burning oil. The comments section divided quickly. Some voices were sharp. He saved kids and got fired for it? This man did what others should have done. We need mechanics like him. We're ready to help. Others were skeptical. What if he'd made a mistake? Who would answer for that? You can't allow improvisation in school transportation. Rules aren't just paper. In Miles's own feed, a post appeared from the foundation built by hands, which had come out publicly against his firing. A quote from the post read, "He's not a hero. He just didn't look away. We need more like him. We're ready to help." The inspector glanced at the screen, but the camera kept rolling. Rita delivered the final verdict. Contract terminated effective immediately. Access to the shop revoked. The signed termination form was laid down right over the bolt Miles hadn't yet pocketed. He looked up, but didn't argue, out of respect for his own nerves, and because he had already chosen his side yesterday. The depot manager, assuming the reputational fire had been contained, turned off the mic. But the live stream had already spread across social media. The creak of the exit door was heard by hundreds. An hour later, the first technical breakdowns appeared. Independent analyst Ethan Caldwell posted thermal load graphs proving that the hydraulic unit Miles had assembled held 18% more stress than the factory version. His post spread faster than any official rebuttal. Back at the depot, an unusual silence had settled. The mechanics, usually loud with sports talk, stood in quiet clusters, watching Miles go. He passed them without hiding the empty tool bag in his hand, and only at the gate did he pause to slip the bolt back into his pocket. Outside, a light drizzle had started. Miles stepped into the parking lot and suddenly noticed two cars pulling up near the fence, one with the logo of a local news station, the other bearing a sticker from the Spruce Creek Parent Committee. The reporters were still setting up their tripods, but the parents were already holding signs. "We need someone who fixes, not just signs." Miles's phone buzzed. First, a message from an old school friend. "Hang in there. The whole town is watching." Then a notification from a crowdfunding platform. Someone had started a campaign for the shop where safety comes before protocol. The total kept climbing, right there on the screen. He pulled up the collar of his jacket, breathed in the damp air, and for the first time in years felt that being fired might not be an ending, but a beginning. Spruce Creek, the canyon bridge, 5 cents of copper in his pocket. It all came together now at one point, where principle proved stronger than policy, and the city saw it live. 5 days after the dismissal, a strange envelope appeared in Miles's mailbox. No return address, only a stamp that read, "Delivered by hand." Inside lay a hand-drawn power steering diagram, identical to the one he had built for bus number 17 in a short note. "It works. Thank you, no signature, no logo, only the handwriting, unmistakably straight, just like Harold Becker's, the driver of that new bus whose official unit had failed on the way back." Miles kept the letter with him when, the next morning, he drove to the shop at Main and Forge, an old shed that had once housed the city van. Now a makeshift sign read Campbell's Corner, a single workbench stood inside, and a pile of used parts collected from neighbors rose beside it. Everything was crooked, dusty, cold, yet on the very first day a teenager came in with a battered BMX. Then another, and a week later, a mother bringing her daughter's wheelchair, asking him not to turn them away. During the first days, no one showed up at all. The lamp burned, the tools lay ready, but the door never opened. Miles simply came, sat at the bench, and waited. And he never turned anyone away. Not because he wanted to make money, but because he didn't know how to act otherwise. Within 3 weeks, they had repaired more than 24 old bicycles and a couple of children's scooters. They worked evenings, on donations, with no price list. Sometimes a repair was paid for with apples, sometimes with a simple thank you. Miles kept no tally. What mattered was the feeling that his hands were needed again. One evening, with rain drumming on the roof and the kettle humming, he was fixing a skateboard for a boy of about 13. The kid crouched nearby, twisting a backpack string between his fingers, and suddenly blurted, "We don't have places like this at school. Just don't close, okay?" Miles looked at him, said nothing, but his gaze was warm, almost a promise. The next day, a black Toyota pulled up outside. A man in a formal coat, no umbrella, stepped out and introduced himself. Brent Rowley, founder of the Built by Hands Foundation. He left a card. On it, his name, phone number, and a single line. "If you change your mind, no problem. Not everyone gets a chance." Then he left without waiting for a reply. He returned the following day, holding a small bundle tied with twine. Inside were documents, a partnership proposal. His daughter, it turned out, had ridden on that very bus number. 17, and on that canyon turn it had saved them from disaster. He had seen the news story, the live stream of the firing, and, most importantly, the wave of parents petitioning the school board to bring Miles back. But he hadn't come out of sympathy. He was looking for someone who could fix things and put principle above procedure. "Listen," Brent said, kneeling onto a crate of bolts. "I'm not running a charity. My foundation is barely staying afloat. If you miss the deadline, I lose the grant. It'll cost me more than it will cost you." He sighed. "But damn it, I need people like you." From his pocket, he produced a brass key, numbered with a small tag that read, "Forge House, South Workshop." This key used to belong to my father. He worked without a license too, until the day he helped a bus driver. They came for him, and instead of a fine, they gave him a building. Since then, we keep one rule: one craftsman, one chance. Interested? Miles stayed silent for a long time. He looked at his hands, calloused, cut, smelling of metal. At the bench where a rebuilt pump stood, at the kids rolling frame parts in the corner, then at the key, and simply took it. A week later, the old shed reopened under a new name, Haven Mechanics. Here they taught not just tightening bolts, but caring. No one could fix a machine without first understanding why. Kids brought not only their bikes, but, for the first time, the belief that adults don't always stay silent when it's time to speak. The city council never wrote about it. Yet Sarah McMillan, that very driver of bus number 17 once stopped by with a box of chocolate muffins. She said only, "You were right, he handled better than the new one," and left. In Rita Olson's office, meanwhile, a memo on personal management risks now hung. Rumors said an internal audit had forced her to resign of her own accord. Miles felt no triumph. It was enough that on Friday an unfamiliar boy of about 13 came to the shop door and asked, "Are you really the one who saved the bus?" Miles wasn't sure how to answer. He simply turned and pointed to the wall, where the same bolt hung framed. Beneath it a plaque read, "Cost of refusing compromise 5 cents, value unknown." And the key in his pocket was proof of that. Monday began without rush. On the outskirts of Pine Harbor, the air was still cool, carrying the scent of morning dust and yesterday's spilled motor oil. At Haven Mechanics, the horn Miles had wired himself sounded precisely at 7:05. Brief, unceremonious, not for show, but as a quiet reminder that the workday begins not with orders, but with the willingness to be needed. Inside, things remained modest. Tools hung neatly on the walls, a stack of old tires rested in the corner, and near the window a coffee pot, blackened from years of use, kept silent company. But something had changed. At the bench where he used to work alone, now sat two teenagers, one with a screwdriver, the other with a notebook, carefully recording which bolt came from where and where it was meant to go. Miles offered no instructions. He simply observed. Because he knew, silent trust teaches more than any manual. On the wall hung the same frame bolt, and beneath it a second plaque had been added. Not factory-made, not engraved, just a piece of plywood with the message burned into the grain. If a machine runs right, it means someone didn't give up. The city had slowly begun to forget why he'd been fired. Protocols were deleted, officials replaced, headlines faded from the feeds. But some drivers still asked him, quietly, "The horn, just so we know it still holds together." Every Monday, Miles stepped out to the gates, stood beneath the shade of a tree, and watched the convoy pass. Sometimes someone waved, sometimes they didn't. But the very fact that the line moved, without breakdowns, without screeches, without fear in the turns, was the best feedback he could ever receive. That day, the last to pass was the bus from Spruce Creek. The same number, 17. It had been partly rebuilt, but inside, the original hydraulic unit still worked. The one he'd assembled that night. The driver rolled down the window, said nothing, just raised two fingers to his temple in a silent salute. No horn. It wasn't needed. Miles stood still until the sound disappeared down the road. Then he turned and stepped back inside. He opened the shop, switched on the light, wiped down the bench and said, "Today, brakes. No need to rush." The teenagers nodded. One of them stood, walked over to the shelf, pulled out a box of ratchets, and paused. "If we collect the parts ourselves, I know a place that gives away old pulleys, belts, even bearings. Can we try?" Miles looked at him, and for the first time that morning he smiled. On the box near the wall sat an unopened envelope from the tax office. A reminder about the rent, 15 days left to settle it. Miles didn't rush to open it, because sometimes the loudest changes begin with the quietest sound. And sometimes to change the route, you don't have to shout. You just have to turn the key and wait for the silence.